Welcome to Momentum Mind, the place where we dive into the minds of the world's most fascinating entrepreneurs and uncover the secrets behind their success, failures, and unstoppable drive. Today, we're stepping into the story of a man whose vision was bigger than reality itself, and the lessons it can teach us about momentum, ambition, and the price of belief. Chapter 1: The Man Who Could Bend Air. The city shimmered like a mirage made of glass and hunger. Towers rose as if pulled upward by invisible strings, their windows catching the light and throwing it back in sharp flashes, like signals meant only for those who knew how to read them. Inside those towers, people moved quickly, speaking in soft urgent voices, clutching cups of bitter coffee, eyes fixed on glowing screens that promised power if stared at long enough. This was a city that believed in speed and size, a place where ideas were spoken of as if they were spells. In a narrow apartment that smelled of dust and old takeout, a man stood barefoot by a window that barely opened. He watched the city as if it were alive, as if it might look back at him and recognize something familiar. His hair was always a little wild, as though he had just stepped out of a storm. His eyes burned with the restless shine of someone who could not sit still inside his own thoughts. He spoke often, even when alone. Words spilled out of him like sparks. He talked about belonging, about energy, about building something that would swallow loneliness whole. He believed buildings could feel alive if filled with the right people, if the walls could hum with ambition and shared dreams. Offices, he said, were dead things. He wanted to resurrect them. When he walked into rooms, he changed the temperature. Conversations slowed, then leaned toward him. He listened just long enough to understand what people wanted to hear, then gave it back to them, shaped into something brighter. He had a gift for turning doubt into momentum. He could make tired ideas feel newborn. At first, it was small. A single shared space carved out of a tired old building. Long wooden tables. White walls. Plants reaching toward the light as if they too wanted a chance. Music floated through the air, low and constant, like a heartbeat. People arrived carrying laptops and uncertainty, and left feeling as though they had joined a movement rather than rented a desk. He walked the floors barefoot, greeting everyone as if they were family. He hugged strangers. He laughed loudly. He spoke about changing how people lived and worked, about tearing down old rules written by men who no longer understood the world. His voice echoed off concrete and glass, filling the space until it felt too small to hold him. Money began to appear, quietly at first. It came in through glass doors carried by calm men in dark clothes who nodded slowly as he spoke. They watched his hands as much as his face. They felt the pull of his certainty, the way he spoke about the future as if he had already been there and come back with stories. The city responded. More buildings opened their doors. More floors were stripped down and reborn. The shared spaces multiplied, spreading across neighborhoods like a growing organism. Each new place looked the same and yet felt unique, designed to convince anyone who entered that they were exactly where they belonged. Inside these spaces, time behaved strangely. Days blurred together. Work spilled into night. Beer flowed freely. Conversations stretched long after laptops closed. People spoke of purpose with the same intensity others reserved for faith. The man encouraged this. He told them they were not just working, they were part of something larger. He told them the company was not a company at all, but a state of mind. As the spaces grew, so did the stories. People whispered about the founder who never slept, who could raise money with a single meeting, who dreamed of cities reshaped by his vision. He began to speak not just of work, but of living. Homes would be next. Schools. Entire neighborhoods bound together by the same promise of connection. Those closest to him watched with awe and unease. Meetings stretched endlessly, filled with grand declarations and sudden changes of direction. Plans shifted mid-sentence. What mattered was not precision, but belief. He trusted his instincts above all else, and demanded others do the same. Money flooded in faster now, vast and warm like sunlight. With it came celebration. Private gatherings in dim rooms filled with laughter and music. Glasses raised. Promises made. The man stood at the center of it all, larger than life, speaking of destiny and scale, of how small thinking was the only true enemy. Yet cracks began to whisper beneath the noise. Some buildings cost more than they earned. Some promises stretched beyond what walls and floors could hold. The company spent freely, convinced that growth itself was proof of success. Losses were brushed aside with a smile and a story about tomorrow. Employees felt the tension even as they clung to the dream. They worked harder, stayed longer, told themselves that exhaustion was the price of changing the world. Those who questioned too loudly found themselves drifting away, replaced by others eager to believe the man rarely noticed the departures. He was already somewhere else, chasing a future only he could see. His thoughts leapt ahead, skipping over details, assuming the ground would rise to meet his feet. He spoke about going public, about becoming something so large it could not be ignored. The word value hung in the air, heavy and undefined, treated like an inevitability rather than a question. In quiet moments, late at night, he sometimes returned to the window. The city looked different then. Darker. Quieter. The towers no longer flashed signals of approval. He pressed his hand to the glass, as if to steady himself. For a brief moment, doubt crept in, thin and sharp. Then it vanished, drowned out by the familiar surge of certainty, because the city still watched him. Investors still called. Employees still cheered when he entered a room. The spaces still buzzed with life. And as long as that energy flowed, as long as belief filled the air, he saw no reason to slow down. Far below, the streets carried on, indifferent and patient. Buildings stood waiting, ready to be claimed or abandoned. The city had seen men like him before, rising fast on waves of conviction. It had also seen how gravity eventually made itself known, but for now, the man smiled at his reflection in the glass, convinced he could bend even that. Chapter 2, Towers of Glass and Smoke. The city never slept, but inside the newly polished towers, it sometimes felt like the world outside had paused to watch him. He moved from floor to floor, his presence a kind of gravity that pulled everything toward him. The walls were pristine white, the air filled with the soft hum of machines and quiet conversations, but he could feel the undercurrent, the anxious energy, the eagerness, the fear hiding behind smiles. It didn't matter, it only made the effect stronger. He had a way of making ambition feel tangible. You could almost see it twisting through the air like smoke, curling around his fingers when he gestured, filling the corners of the office spaces with invisible fire. Employees followed him with notebooks and laptops, hanging on every word, scribbling mantras he barely remembered speaking. Their eyes held something like worship, though they'd never admit it. Worship didn't need a name here. Belief was enough. The towers themselves seemed to hum beneath his feet. Some floors were open-air terraces with grass and small trees, odd for a city that lived on concrete. Some floors were filled with endless rows of desks, screens glowing like miniature suns in the dim light. The design was deliberate. Chaos and order existed side by side, reflecting the duality he carried in his own mind. The spaces were meant to inspire, but also to test. People thrived in the uncertainty, stretching themselves in ways they never thought possible. He thrived, too. Meetings stretched for hours, though he never seemed to tire. He moved from conversation to conversation, shifting tone like a conductor guiding an orchestra of nervous hearts. One moment he was charming, laughing at a half-baked idea, the next he was sharp, cutting through hesitation with a single, well-placed question. Those around him learned quickly, to survive here was to anticipate not just the next instruction, but the next impulse, the next whim, the next sudden inspiration that would sweep through like a storm. Money came faster than ever, arriving in glossy black envelopes and digital transfers that made the numbers on spreadsheets feel like magic. Investors didn't just hand it over, they fell under his spell, convinced that this was a chance to touch something rare, something larger than themselves. He spoke of growth with the ease of someone speaking of breathing. Expansion wasn't a goal, it was an inevitability, but the deeper the towers reached into the clouds, the thinner the floors felt beneath him. Rumors of instability whispered through the hallways, but no one wanted to believe them aloud. Cost overruns were shrugged off. Contracts were vague, intentionally blurry, because clarity was too limiting. Profit was not a number, it was a feeling, a pulse, a current you could ride if you dared. And he dared. Always late one evening, he wandered through a floor that had been newly stripped of its walls and furniture. Dust hung in the air like a fog, caught in the beams of the setting sun slicing through the windows. He raised a hand, imagining what it could become. A gym. A meditation space. A cafeteria that felt like a palace. He could see the future of the space, perfectly painted in his mind. And yet, in the quiet, a faint shadow flickered behind his eyes, a suggestion that not everything would bend as easily as he believed. People followed him without hesitation, but even the most devoted began to notice odd patterns. Employees would disappear for days. Promises of raises and bonuses arrived late, if at all. Some floors were so overstuffed with desks and equipment that people stumbled over one another, chasing tasks that seemed to multiply on their own. Yet when they tried to speak up, he was always ready. A smile. A story. A grand vision. Belief smoothed over every misstep. He loved the chaos. It made him feel alive. Meetings that stretched endlessly, emails that arrived in the dead of night, calls that pulled people from dinner or sleep, it was all a test, a game only he fully understood. And they all wanted to play. They wanted to rise with him, to feel the current he rode. They wanted to see the world the way he did, towering and impossible, yet achingly close. On one particular evening, as neon lights painted the streets below in a harsh, artificial glow, he gathered the top team in a glass-walled boardroom. The city reflected off the walls, duplicating itself infinitely, making it hard to tell where one space ended and the next began. He leaned forward, fingers drumming the polished table, and spoke of vision in words that sounded like incantations. He painted a future so vast, so shimmering, that no one dared ask how they would reach it. Then came the pause. A long silence hung in the air. He let it stretch, letting uncertainty seep into the edges of the room. It was a test. They felt it. Some clutched notebooks, some stared at the floor. Then he smiled, almost too wide, almost too bright. "We're going to change the way the world thinks about work," he said. "And anyone who doubts, they'll just have to catch up." The words should have comforted them. They didn't. Beneath the glow of the towers, a chill lingered. For the first time, the top team noticed that the pulse of expansion was not steady, it skipped, hiccuped, and faltered. Numbers were promised, but not verified. Plans were made, then remade. The excitement that had carried them this far began to feel like something brittle. He did not notice. He moved to the window, pressing his hand against the cool glass, staring out at the skyline that spread endlessly. The city twinkled below, each light a story, a hope, a dream he intended to command. He imagined new towers, taller than the last, stretching into clouds that had no name. He imagined wealth so vast it would have no meaning except to those who believed in him. Then, a small vibration ran through the building. A subtle shudder, barely perceptible, like the floor itself had taken a deep, frightened breath. He felt it under his toes, the way a conductor feels a wrong note in an orchestra. He blinked and shook his head, convinced it was nothing. But the others in the room stiffened. Whispers ran behind closed doors. Doubt had arrived, uninvited, and for the first time, they wondered if the towers could hold him, or if they would finally bend back against him. A shadow of a question flickered across the glass walls, catching him just for a heartbeat before he turned away, smiling as if the moment had never happened. Yet outside, the city seemed quieter, almost watchful, as if it knew something the man could not yet see. And somewhere, deep in the foundations of the tallest tower, a low rumble hinted that the ground itself might not be as certain as it appeared. Chapter 3, The Golden Illusion. The city below shimmered in a haze of neon and fog, its streets winding like veins carrying the lifeblood of ambition. From his perch high in one of the newest towers, he could see it all, an ocean of movement, of desire, of whispered deals and urgent meetings. But he was never satisfied with mere observation. He wanted control. He wanted to mold it, to bend it to his will, as if the streets themselves were clay beneath his fingers. Inside the tower, the offices were alive with the low hum of constant motion. Laptops glowed, voices overlapped, and the scent of coffee mixed with the faint tang of expensive cleaning solutions. He moved through the rooms barefoot, a figure of impossible energy, leaving an invisible wake. People followed him instinctively, drawn by his vision and terrified by its speed. When he spoke, the walls seemed to lean in, the air vibrating with the promise of grandeur. He had begun a new project, one that would define him, one that would make him untouchable. It was called the Golden Project, though he never used the word project aloud. To him, names diluted magic. He only spoke of it in visions, describing vast spaces, impossible networks, and a value so immense it could rewrite the rules of business. Investors licked their lips at the suggestion, willing to give him everything without question. He called meetings in a boardroom that felt more like a throne chamber than a workplace. Glass walls reflected the city endlessly, and the golden lights of the sunset spilled in like fire. He paced, hands gesturing, voice rising and falling in waves. People scribbled furiously, unsure if they were recording reality or his imagination. It hardly mattered. Reality bent around him anyway. Employees whispered among themselves about the Golden Project. It was glamorous, yes, but it was also terrifying. Budgets were pushed aside. Deadlines were illusions. The only measure was faith, faith that the founder could see the future, that he had already walked there and returned with its secrets. Some believed, fully, their hearts hammering with excitement. Others felt the first prickling unease, a sense that the golden glow was hiding shadows beneath it. Money continued to pour in, faster and brighter than ever. Checks arrived in thick envelopes, in digital transfers with sums so vast they made the brain ache. Investors no longer asked questions, they only nodded, smiling, afraid that doubt would make them miss something historic. And the man? He smiled back, radiant and untouchable, treating each new influx as proof that he was right, that the world bent to his will. Yet even in the heat of his triumph, cracks appeared. Documents went missing. Contracts were vague to the point of absurdity. Suppliers complained, employees grew restless, and a small but persistent hum of panic rippled through the floors. The man ignored it. Doubt, he believed, was a weakness of the timid. He could not be timid. Not now. Not ever. Late one night, he wandered the halls of the Golden Project's headquarters. Lights flickered faintly, machines hummed in their endless rhythm, and the scent of fresh paint mingled with the sterile air. He could feel the potential in every corner, the way a musician feels the vibration of a note before it is played. He imagined the grand opening, investors and press and the world watching him as a god of creation. And yet, in the back of his mind, a tiny, unwelcome thought nudged at him, something fragile, something he refused to acknowledge. The employees closest to him began to notice strange patterns. Promises were made but rarely kept. Figures were manipulated, stretched, and polished until they gleamed, though the reality underneath was far less certain. Some began to whisper among themselves, unsure if fear or insight guided them. But fear was dangerous to speak aloud. And insight? Insight was wasted on the weak. The Golden Project grew, seemingly unstoppable. Its spaces multiplied, stretching across the city, consuming buildings and neighborhoods. Each new office was brighter, cleaner, more perfect than the last. People moved through them as if enchanted, caught in a rhythm of work, belief, and devotion. They smiled, laughed, typed furiously, and celebrated small victories, all under the warm glow of golden ambition. And yet, in quiet corners, shadows whispered. The expenses were immense, growing faster than the revenue could support. Deals that seemed secure began to wobble, revealing fragile foundations beneath the shine. Some employees noticed, some investors sensed it, but they all clutched the golden promise tightly, unwilling to admit what might be lurking underneath. One evening, he gathered the team for a celebration unlike any before. The room gleamed with polished surfaces and golden lights. Glasses clinked, laughter rang out, and music pulsed through the space like a heartbeat. He stood at the center, smiling, exuding energy so intense it was almost painful to look at directly. "We are unstoppable," he said, voice echoing off the walls. "We are rewriting the rules. Anyone who doubts will be left behind." But as the night wore on, as champagne flowed and lights glimmered, a subtle tension began to weave through the crowd. Whispers flickered like candle flames. Some employees glanced at spreadsheets, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others noticed that numbers did not add up, that promises were thin, that the golden glow might be a reflection, not reality. The man, of course, did not see it. He stood on a raised platform, gesturing, speaking, smiling. He had imagined a future so vivid, so undeniable, that he could not see the cracks forming beneath his feet. And yet, deep inside, a small part of him, a whisper buried beneath ambition and certainty, felt a tremor, faint and almost imperceptible. As the evening drew to a close, he left the celebration early, wandering the empty hallways of the Golden Project alone. The lights reflected in endless repetitions along the glass walls. For a moment, the silence was absolute, and he could hear his own heartbeat, sharp and loud in the stillness. Then, at the far end of the hallway, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow that should not have been there. He squinted, leaning forward, heart racing in a way that was unfamiliar. The golden glow of the project suddenly seemed fragile, almost delicate. And in that moment, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before, the first real sense of danger. Behind the polished walls and the glow of ambition, the foundations of everything he had built were shifting. And when he turned the corner, he realized, with a jolt that made his pulse thunder, that the shadow was not just a trick of the light. Something, or someone, was waiting. Watching. Ready to remind him that even the brightest illusions can crumble. The Golden Project, for all its brilliance, had secrets. And tonight, one of them had decided it was time to reveal itself. Chapter 4, Cracks in the Mirror. The city never felt smaller than when he looked down from the highest floor of his newest tower. From here, the streets seemed to twist unnaturally, snaking through neighborhoods like veins, carrying ambition and desperation in equal measure. Neon signs flickered, reflecting off rain-slicked asphalt, while faint sirens hummed somewhere far below. He leaned against the glass, fingers pressed to the cool surface, imagining the empire he was building, a shimmering lattice of towers, spaces, and dreams, all bound together by his vision. Inside, the tower buzzed with the quiet chaos of work. Employees moved with almost frantic energy, chasing tasks that multiplied like shadows. Laptops glowed in the dim light, spreadsheets and charts scrolling endlessly. Phones rang without pause. Some people laughed, some muttered curses under their breath, but all moved as if caught in a current that could not be resisted. He thrived here, feeding off the energy, turning exhaustion into devotion, yet cracks were beginning to appear, subtle at first, like tiny fractures in a mirror. Documents didn't align. Contracts were vague or contradictory. Budgets were stretched beyond recognition. Numbers danced in spreadsheets, seeming right at first glance but unraveling when studied too closely. Some employees noticed and whispered, but the walls of the tower were thick, and fear made their voices quiet. He was aware of none of it. His mind was always elsewhere, planning, imagining, convincing. He spoke of new horizons, of expanding into spaces no one had ever dreamed of creating a network so vast it would redefine how people thought about work, about life, about success. Investors heard these words and nodded eagerly, dazzled by the audacity, willing to ignore details that did not fit the picture. One afternoon, he called a meeting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Light poured in, hitting the polished table like gold. He paced, hands gesturing, voice rising and falling like a conductor directing an unseen orchestra. Employees sat around him, some leaning forward, eyes wide with excitement. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, sensing the tension beneath the surface. He spoke of vision and scale and possibility, painting the future with words that shimmered. "We are creating something no one else can touch," he said. "We are beyond competition, beyond doubt. Everything else is obsolete. Everything else will follow us, or fade." His eyes gleamed with certainty, and the room seemed to vibrate with energy, but the undercurrent was growing stronger. Employees whispered in corners, tallying mismatched numbers, questioning timelines, and sharing quiet fears. A few brave souls tried to speak, to raise concerns about costs or unrealistic deadlines, but he dismissed them with a smile or a story of triumph, and the words were swallowed by his momentum. The tension was not just in the numbers. It was in the spaces themselves. Some towers creaked, elevators groaned under load, and systems that were meant to be seamless flickered and failed. The people responsible for maintenance and operations scrambled to fix problems, but the sheer scale of the empire made everything fragile. One misstep could cascade into chaos. Despite this, the energy remained intoxicating. Employees worked longer hours, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, believing they were part of something historic. They stayed late into the night, cleaning and adjusting, making sure the image of perfection remained intact. The founder wandered among them, barefoot and radiant, a figure who seemed impervious to fatigue or doubt. His presence alone kept the machine running, even as its gears ground under impossible strain. Late one night, he walked alone through a floor that had been recently renovated for a new office. The lights were dim, and the echo of his footsteps filled the space. He traced his fingers along the walls, imagining the final form, the perfect alignment of ambition and architecture, the shining symbol of everything he had built. And yet, as he moved, he noticed something faint but unmistakable, a small crack in the glass of a window, tiny but precise, reflecting the city outside in a fragmented way. It was the first tangible sign that not everything could be controlled, that even the brightest surfaces could fracture under pressure. For a moment, he stared, feeling a flicker of unease. Then he shook his head and continued walking, telling himself it was insignificant. He had never let small details slow him down, and he would not start now. The next morning, the tension spread subtly through the floors. Employees arrived early, carrying laptops and anxiety, preparing for another day of relentless pace. Meetings stretched longer, decisions were rushed, and mistakes began to accumulate. Some tried to point them out, but the noise of ambition drowned out reason. The founder moved among them, radiant and untouchable, oblivious to the quiet tremors beneath the surface, but those tremors were growing. Suppliers began to question payments. Partners noticed inconsistencies in contracts. Employees whispered of stress, exhaustion, and mismanagement. And yet, outwardly, the empire gleamed. Towers reflected sunlight like mirrors. Offices buzzed with the hum of ambition. Investors smiled at the glowing reports and the polished presentations, ignoring the warning signs that blinked faintly in the margins. He believed in momentum above all else. The larger the empire, the harder it would be for doubt to touch him. He trusted his instincts, his vision, his ability to inspire and persuade. And in many ways, it worked. People continued to follow, captivated by his energy, believing in the impossible, but the mirror was cracking, and every reflection showed something slightly distorted. Behind the glow, the foundation shifted. Somewhere, in the shadows of the empire, the first threads of collapse were beginning to weave themselves together. The question was no longer if the empire would falter, it was when. As he leaned once more against the glass, looking down at the city below, he did not see the tremors. He saw only possibility, a horizon that stretched endlessly, waiting to be conquered. But the shadows in the hallways, the whispers behind closed doors, and the subtle fractures in the glass all hinted that the world he believed he controlled might not be as certain as he thought. And far below, in the darkened streets, a storm was gathering, silent, patient, and inevitable, waiting for the moment when ambition would finally meet its mirror. Chapter 5: The Price of Belief. The offices were alive with sound, a symphony of urgency and devotion. Fingers tapped furiously on keyboards. Phones rang with persistent insistence. Conversations overlapped in a rhythm that could have been music if one listened long enough to find harmony in the chaos. And at the center of it all moved the founder, barefoot, radiant, untouchable. He carried energy like a torch, setting the pace for everyone around him. He called a meeting in the main hall of the largest tower, a space so vast it swallowed sound. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating polished tables, glass walls, and sleek chairs. Employees filled the room, notebooks open, pens poised, hearts racing with anticipation. Some trembled under the weight of expectation. Others were carried forward by exhilaration. Everyone was aware that this was more than a meeting, it was a performance, and every eye was on him. He spoke of vision, of scale, of transforming work and life into something almost sacred. His words flowed like a river of fire, shaping the room, bending attention, igniting belief. People laughed, nodded, and scribbled manically, trying to keep pace with the torrent. To him, belief was currency. The more they held, the more powerful the empire became. Doubt was a poison, and he treated it as if it were contagious, but belief, like any force, required a price. Some employees noticed first, the endless hours, the missed meals, the blurred boundaries between work and life. They ignored it, at first, because the energy in the rooms was intoxicating, because the promise of greatness seemed worth every sacrifice. And yet, beneath the surface, exhaustion spread, quiet and unrelenting, gnawing at focus and patience. Investors were drawn into the orbit like moths to a brilliant flame. They spoke of opportunity, of innovation, of transformation. They handed over money with almost religious devotion, convinced they were part of history in the making. Contracts and spreadsheets were treated as formalities, mere steps in a process that had already been predetermined by the force of his conviction. The illusion of certainty made them blind, and the cracks? They grew. Buildings were filled to capacity beyond reason. Budgets were stretched to their limits, and still, expansion was demanded. Employees pushed themselves harder, fearing they would be left behind if they faltered. Mistakes multiplied silently, hidden behind layers of optimism and charisma. He did not notice, or perhaps, he refused to. Late one night, he wandered through a floor that had been converted into a lounge for employees. Empty coffee cups littered tables. Chairs were scattered. A single laptop glowed faintly in the corner, its screen filled with incomplete reports. The hum of the HVAC system was a constant companion, the only sound besides his own breathing. He leaned against the wall, eyes closed, and imagined the empire as it would be tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Everything was possibility, everything was growth, and doubt was a distant, meaningless concept. Yet even in his private moments, shadows lingered. Employees whispered quietly in hallways about missing funds, delayed payments, and rising tension among teams. Some were loyal to a fault, covering mistakes and smoothing over cracks, while others began to notice patterns that were impossible to ignore. And though they feared speaking up, they could not escape the gnawing certainty that something was fragile beneath the shine. The founder rarely slept. When he did, it was a restless half-sleep, filled with visions of towers, meetings, and impossible futures. He dreamed of cities transformed by his hands, of spaces humming with energy, of investors and employees, and the world itself bending to the rhythm he set. Sleep was a luxury, and he refused it, feeding instead on caffeine, adrenaline, and the collective devotion of those around him. A particularly quiet evening brought him to the top of the tallest tower, where the wind whipped sharply against the glass. The city stretched endlessly below, a sprawling network of lights, movement, and ambition. He imagined the golden project, the towers, the spaces, all glowing like fireflies, and in his mind, they were indestructible. And yet, a faint tremor ran through the floor beneath his feet, almost imperceptible, like a warning whispered in a language he refused to learn. Inside, the empire was humming, thriving, growing. But the first real signs of strain were appearing. Employees were burning out, budgets were fraying, and the smallest cracks were beginning to show in financial statements that no one dared examine too closely. The higher they climbed, the more precarious everything became, and the cost of belief grew heavier with each passing day. At a late-night gathering, a few employees tried to confront him with concerns. Hesitant voices trembled in the room, masked by smiles and cautious phrasing. He laughed them off, radiant and unshakable. "We're creating the future," he said. "This is nothing. Everything is under control. If you don't believe, you will fall behind." And with that, the conversation ended, leaving a residue of unease that no amount of energy could erase. Outside, the city continued to pulse with life, oblivious to the tension inside the towers. Lights flickered, cars moved like currents through the streets, and neon glimmered against wet asphalt. The founder looked down and imagined the empire spreading beyond what anyone could see, touching every corner of the world with golden ambition. And yet, somewhere deep in the foundations, the price of belief had begun to show itself. A ledger unchecked, a contract misaligned, a promise stretched too thin. The empire shimmered, brilliant and intoxicating, but even the brightest gold hides shadows. And as he turned from the window, smiling and untouchable, a quiet rumble whispered through the tower, as if the world beneath him had begun to stir, preparing to remind him that no belief, however powerful, can escape the weight of consequence. The empire was golden. But even gold can crack. And tonight, the first real fracture was waiting to reveal itself. Chapter 6, The Spell of Expansion. The towers multiplied like seeds scattered by wind. Every neighborhood, every corner of the city seemed to pulse with new offices, new spaces, new promises. It was as if the founder had cast a spell, and the city itself obeyed, bending to the rhythm of his ambition. Lights glowed from every window, screens flickered endlessly, and the hum of activity echoed through streets that never stopped moving. He moved through the towers like a force of nature, barefoot, energy radiating from him, almost impossible to look at directly. Employees fell in step with him, their movements a reflection of his own unrelenting pace. Meetings were no longer discussions, they were ceremonies of belief, where each word, gesture, and glance became part of a larger, invisible choreography. The world outside existed only as context. Here, in these towers, he created reality. Expansion had become an obsession. Every floor, every office, every shared space had to be larger, brighter, more perfect than the last. Employees raced to keep up, their lives folding into the rhythm of construction, design, and presentations. Mistakes were ignored or covered up, no one wanted to challenge the illusion. And the founder thrived on it, drawing strength from their devotion, from the ceaseless motion that confirmed his vision. Investors were enchanted. They handed over money with awe and eagerness, convinced they were witnessing the creation of something that would outlast them all. Contracts were signed without scrutiny, promises accepted without proof. The flow of capital became almost hypnotic, a river feeding the empire, making it seem unstoppable. But expansion comes with shadows. Some floors creaked under the weight of overbuilt desks and equipment. Elevators groaned. Systems failed silently. Employees pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, afraid to step back. Even as they celebrated victories, minor disasters went unnoticed, accumulating beneath the surface like a storm gathering strength. He never paused. Sleep was optional, meals were incidental. He was driven by visions that seemed to exist in another dimension, moving through towers as if they were extensions of his own mind. He spoke of new spaces, entire buildings that would serve as cities within the city. Offices that would not just house work, but create a culture, a mindset, a devotion so strong it could not be broken. Employees whispered in hallways about the pace, about disappearing colleagues, about finances that didn't quite add up. Some tried to raise concerns. Most were silenced, either by fear or by his radiant charisma. Questions of reality were dismissed with visions of the future, painted so brightly that doubt seemed almost sinful. Belief was the only currency. One evening, he called a gathering on the roof of the tallest tower. The city stretched endlessly below, a web of lights, movement, and promise. He stood barefoot, hands raised as if conducting the city itself, speaking in a voice that carried over the wind. He spoke of scale, of domination, of creating something no one else could touch. Investors and employees watched, mesmerized. Some cheered, some whispered prayers to the energy radiating from him. And yet, in the shadows of the crowd, small fissures formed. Employees glanced at one another, sharing quiet concerns. Budgets were fraying. Projects were delayed. Systems failed without explanation. Yet no one dared speak too loudly, for the founder's vision consumed everything, leaving little room for doubt. Late that night, he wandered alone through a floor being renovated for yet another office. The space was empty, echoing with his footsteps. He traced his hands over walls that gleamed with fresh paint, imagining the final product, the perfect combination of light, energy, and human devotion. And for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of unease, a whisper of fragility beneath the brilliance. But he shook it off, convinced the empire could bend any reality to his will. The employees followed him with a mix of reverence and fear. Some whispered of stress and exhaustion. Others noticed missing documents, misplaced contracts, and the tiny, almost invisible cracks that grew wider with each passing day. Yet outwardly, the towers gleamed. Meetings proceeded without pause. Investors smiled at polished presentations. And he, untouchable, radiant, continued to command the flow of energy, the devotion of people, the movement of money, as if the world itself were a stage and he the master of all scenes. But the foundations beneath expansion were weakening. The more he built, the more fragile the empire became. And though no one dared acknowledge it, a storm was forming, quiet, patient, inevitable. As he stood once more on the rooftop, gazing at the city, wind tearing through his hair, a shadow flickered across the glass walls behind him. He turned, smiled, and dismissed it. But the shadow did not vanish. Somewhere inside the tower, a system faltered. Somewhere, a promise was breaking. And somewhere, the first thread of collapse had begun to twist toward him, ready to test the limits of belief and ambition alike. The spell of expansion was powerful, intoxicating, and blinding. But every spell has a cost. And the cost was beginning to show. Chapter 7, The Illusion of Control. The towers gleamed in the morning sun, their glass facades reflecting ambition and promise. From the top floors, the city stretched endlessly, streets and alleys forming a patchwork of light and shadow. He stood by the window, barefoot as always, hands pressed against the cool glass, feeling the pulse of the city beneath him. To him, it was alive, obedient, and malleable. Every street, every office, every whispered conversation felt like a note in the symphony he conducted. Inside, the empire buzzed with unrelenting energy. Employees moved with a speed that seemed impossible, chasing deadlines and tasks that multiplied faster than anyone could track. Laptops glowed endlessly, screens scrolling with numbers that promised growth, charts that promised triumph, and forecasts that promised inevitability. And at the center of it all was him, radiant and untouchable, moving through spaces like a force of nature. He spoke often of control, of shaping the world to fit his vision, of bending reality with sheer will. Meetings were long, intense, and theatrical. Employees wrote feverishly, trying to capture the brilliance of his thoughts before they shifted, vanished, or transformed into something new. He demanded devotion, absolute and unwavering, and those who wavered found themselves quietly edged out, replaced by others eager to believe. Investors followed him blindly, captivated by his charisma, dazzled by the scale of his ambition. Money flowed like a river, and he treated it as if it were endless. Contracts and agreements were mere formalities, the details insignificant compared to the larger vision. The higher he reached, the more unstoppable he seemed. And the more unstoppable he seemed, the more belief consumed everyone around him. But beneath the glow, cracks were spreading. Floors were overbuilt, systems strained, and expenses soared beyond comprehension. Employees whispered of stress and exhaustion. Some noticed numbers that didn't add up, contracts that were vague or contradictory, promises that could not be fulfilled. And though the founder radiated confidence, the whispers of doubt gathered strength in hidden corners, like shadows moving in the periphery of the empire. One afternoon, he walked through a newly completed floor, empty except for polished tables and glowing screens. He imagined the space filled with energy, creativity, and devotion. The walls gleamed, the light bounced perfectly, and he could almost hear the hum of activity that would soon consume it. But a faint crack in the corner caught his eye, tiny and almost imperceptible, like a whisper he was unwilling to hear. He ignored it. Control, he believed, was not about acknowledging every flaw, it was about convincing everyone else that the flaws did not exist. He trusted his instincts above all else. He trusted the devotion of his employees, the awe of his investors, and the inevitability of his vision. And yet, in the quiet of that empty floor, a flicker of unease grazed the edge of his mind. Meetings became longer, more elaborate, more theatrical. Employees were pulled in every direction at once, juggling tasks, presentations, and the constant expectation of brilliance. Mistakes were smoothed over, covered up, or ignored entirely. Success was measured not by numbers but by momentum. As long as the energy kept flowing, as long as belief remained unbroken, the illusion of control was complete, yet the cracks were multiplying. Some employees began to quietly document discrepancies, noting missing funds, delayed payments, and patterns that defied logic. Suppliers grew impatient. Partners whispered concerns that could not be heard over the roar of expansion. And still, the founder remained untouchable, smiling, radiating certainty, a living symbol of unstoppable ambition. One evening, he called a meeting on the top floor of the tallest tower. The city stretched below, a web of lights reflecting promise and danger alike. He spoke of future plans, new towers, new projects, each more ambitious than the last. Investors nodded eagerly, employees took furious notes, and the room pulsed with energy. Every word reinforced the illusion that he controlled everything, that nothing could stop the empire, that every risk was manageable. But as the meeting drew on, a subtle tension filled the room. Eyes flicked toward spreadsheets, murmurs whispered in hallways, and the first hints of dissent glimmered in small, careful movements. Even the most devoted employees felt it, the faint tremor of reality brushing against the edges of ambition. And though no one spoke openly, the founder remained unaware, enthralled by his own certainty. Late that night, he wandered the empty hallways of the tower alone. The lights reflected endlessly on polished floors and glass walls, multiplying his image in infinite repetition. He pressed his hand to the glass, imagining the empire sprawling across the city, the country, the world. Control, he thought, was absolute. He had shaped everything. He had molded the city, the investors, the employees, the very rhythm of work itself, but shadows moved quietly behind the glow. Systems failed without warning, numbers were misaligned, promises stretched beyond reality, and employees whispered in hidden corners. The cracks were no longer subtle, they were becoming impossible to ignore, even if the founder refused to see them. As he gazed out over the city, a gust of wind rattled the glass, and the reflection of the tower seemed to warp slightly, as if reality itself was bending away from his control. For a heartbeat, he paused, heart quickening. Then he smiled, shook his head, and turned away, convinced it was nothing. But the seeds of collapse had already been planted, and the empire he believed untouchable was starting to tremble. The illusion of control was strong, intoxicating, and convincing. But somewhere beneath the polished floors and glowing offices, the first real fracture was widening, preparing to remind him that no matter how brilliant, how charismatic, or how unstoppable one could seem, even the mightiest towers could crack. And tonight, the city waited, patient and silent, for the first signs of the unraveling to appear. Chapter 8, The Cost of Momentum. The towers stretched higher every day, their glass facades reflecting ambition and desire like molten mirrors. From the upper floors, the city appeared as a living map of energy, movement, and possibility. Streets twisted below like veins, carrying the pulse of commerce, gossip, and urgency. And at the center of it all, barefoot and radiant, he moved through his empire as though it were an extension of himself, a machine fueled by devotion and adrenaline. The offices were a blur of motion. Employees rushed from meeting to meeting, fingers flying across keyboards, screens glowing like stars in the dim light. Phones rang without pause. Conversations overlapped in a chorus of ambition and fear. Mistakes were ignored or corrected hastily, as though the energy of the empire could smooth over every imperfection. And he thrived on it, feeding on the current of motion, the devotion that surrounded him like air. Expansion had become the heartbeat of the company. Floors were renovated, buildings acquired, and offices filled beyond capacity. Every space reflected the same principles: energy, openness, and the illusion of possibility. The founder wandered through them, barefoot and unstoppable, turning chaos into choreography, confusion into devotion. Belief was the only law that mattered, but momentum comes at a cost. Employees began to fray under the relentless pace. Days blended into nights, meals were skipped, sleep became a memory. Some whispered quietly about exhaustion, others about projects that could not keep pace with the promises. Numbers and budgets began to show strain, but no one dared speak too loudly. Fear, and the pull of devotion, silenced them. Investors, intoxicated by the spectacle, ignored the whispers. Money continued to flow in like a river, unchecked, unchallenged, feeding expansion beyond reason. Contracts and documents were treated as rituals, not instruments of accountability. The empire grew, dazzling and untouchable, yet beneath the surface, systems creaked, deadlines collapsed, and the tiniest miscalculations began to spiral. Late one night, he wandered through a newly completed floor, empty except for polished tables and glowing screens. He traced his hand along the walls, imagining the energy that would soon fill the space. His mind leapt ahead, sketching entire buildings, new towers, and cities. Possibility seemed infinite. And yet, a faint tremor ran through the floor beneath him, a subtle reminder that even the brightest visions rested on fragile foundations. Employees began to notice the strain more clearly. Some stayed silent, grinding through exhaustion. Others whispered of missing funds, delayed payments, and misaligned projects. But every concern was met with stories of growth, visions of grandeur, or the founder's radiant energy, which seemed to bend reality itself. Belief was mandatory, and doubt dangerous. At a boardroom meeting, he paced back and forth, speaking of expansion, scale, and inevitability. Employees scribbled furiously, investors nodded in awe, and everyone moved in the rhythm he set. Every word reinforced the momentum, every gesture pulled the room into his orbit. Momentum, he believed, was unstoppable, and anyone who questioned it was simply too weak to follow. But the cost was mounting. Systems strained under weight. Budgets no longer balanced. Projects duplicated errors, hidden beneath layers of belief. Employees skipped meals, worked through nights, and yet it was never enough. Momentum demanded more. It consumed energy, health, sanity, and slowly, invisibly, the cracks in the empire widened. One evening, after the offices had emptied, he wandered to the top floor alone. The city lights shimmered below, a glittering network of possibilities. He pressed his hand against the glass, feeling the pulse of the empire beneath his fingertips, imagining the empire stretching beyond the skyline, beyond the horizon, beyond the world itself. Momentum, he thought, was proof of greatness. Momentum was control. Momentum was life, and yet, in the quiet, he felt it, the faint tremor that had been ignored, the whisper of fragility beneath the shine. He shook his head, smiled, and turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the truth. Momentum had a price, he told himself. But he refused to calculate it, refused to see it, refused to slow down. The empire gleamed, radiant and unstoppable. Investors were enthralled, employees obedient, buildings towering. And still, beneath the glow, the foundations strained. Mistakes multiplied, systems faltered, and the cost of unbroken momentum crept quietly through the floors. Tonight, the city waited beneath the towers, unaware of the tension within. Momentum surged like a river racing toward a cliff, powerful and mesmerizing. And somewhere inside the empire, the first hints of collapse were beginning to whisper, small tremors that would not be silenced, no matter how radiant the founder remained. The cost of momentum was coming due. And when it arrived, no amount of energy, belief, or vision could stop it. Chapter 9, The Shimmering Edge. The city glowed like liquid gold under the evening sky, lights reflecting in the slick streets, in the glass of towers, and in the eyes of those who still believed. From the tallest of his towers, the founder looked out, barefoot and radiant, feeling the pulse of the empire beneath him. Each building, each floor, each desk carried energy, his energy, and yet, tonight, something felt different. A subtle tension hummed beneath the shine, like static in the air before a storm. Inside, the empire moved like a living organism. Laptops glowed endlessly. Phones rang without pause. Employees raced through endless tasks, chasing deadlines that were more illusion than structure. Meetings bled into one another, presentations and pitches weaving a rhythm that kept the wheels turning. And he moved among it all, a conductor of devotion, charisma, and fear, turning chaos into motion, and motion into momentum. Expansion had reached a fever pitch. Every floor, every office, every shared space shimmered with polish, light, and promise. Investors came with eager eyes and open hands, handing over money as if it were a sacred offering. Contracts and spreadsheets were formalities, belief was the only true measure of value. The higher he climbed, the more unstoppable he seemed. And the more unstoppable he seemed, the more the empire believed it could not fall. But the shimmer hid fractures. Floors were strained, budgets stretched beyond comprehension, and systems groaned under invisible weight. Employees whispered in hidden corners about exhaustion, missing funds, and projects that no longer made sense. They feared speaking up, fearing his radiant certainty and the energy that seemed to bend reality around him. Some tried to document problems in secret, hoping for a chance to correct them before they became catastrophic. One evening, he called a meeting in the largest boardroom, glass walls reflecting the city endlessly. Investors sat in awe, employees scribbled feverishly, and the founder paced like a storm, gesturing and speaking in waves that pulled everyone forward. "We are creating the future," he said. "Everything else is obsolete. Everything else will follow, or be left behind." His eyes blazed with conviction. His energy was magnetic. Belief flowed like a river, sweeping all doubt aside. Yet, behind the shimmer, tension thickened. Emails went unanswered. Systems lagged. Budgets no longer aligned with reality. Mistakes, small at first, began to multiply, hiding beneath layers of expansion. Employees noticed, some with quiet dread, others with a creeping panic. And the founder, radiant as ever, remained unaware, lost in visions of towers stretching into clouds, of cities reshaped by his hand. Late that night, he wandered through a newly acquired building, empty and echoing, its walls gleaming under fluorescent light. He imagined the energy that would soon inhabit it, the teams, the projects, the devotion. Every floor was a potential, every wall a promise. But the shimmer of perfection could not hide the subtle cracks. A door creaked unexpectedly. A light flickered. A faint sense of instability hummed beneath his feet, almost imperceptible, almost ignorable. Employees were beginning to falter. Exhaustion whispered through the hallways, mistakes grew bolder, and some began questioning the brilliance they had once worshipped. The founder's charisma could bend almost anything, but belief alone could not fix a system strained beyond its limits. The shimmer, dazzling and radiant, hid danger as effectively as it inspired awe. He remained untouchable in appearance, moving from floor to floor, radiating certainty, transforming fear into devotion, chaos into motion. Investors continued to pour in money, dazzled by the scale of expansion, ignoring the tremors beneath the surface. But the cracks were growing, persistent, impossible to silence entirely. That night, standing on the rooftop of the tallest tower, he pressed his hand to the glass, feeling the pulse of the empire beneath him. The city stretched infinitely, a labyrinth of ambition, light, and desire. He imagined new towers, new acquisitions, new projects, each more brilliant than the last. Momentum surged through him like electricity, intoxicating and unstoppable, but the shimmer had an edge. Somewhere beneath the glow, systems faltered. Budgets diverged. Employees faltered. Mistakes multiplied. The first whispers of collapse, small and quiet, grew sharper, like cracks running through glass, invisible until the moment they split entirely. For a heartbeat, he felt it, a subtle shift, a tremor that he could not ignore. Then he shook his head, smiled, and dismissed it. Belief, he thought, was all that mattered. Control, charisma, energy, these were the forces that shaped reality. And yet, beyond the shimmer, the edge of instability waited patiently, growing, silent, inevitable. The empire gleamed, radiant and unstoppable, shimmering like gold against the night. But the edge was near. And when the first piece finally broke, there would be no turning back. Chapter 10, The Gathering Storm. The city pulsed below, a labyrinth of streets, lights, and restless ambition. From his perch in the tallest tower, the founder could see it all, the weaving currents of traffic, the flicker of neon signs, the tiny sparks of life in the offices far below. To him, it was a map of potential, of opportunity, of power waiting to be claimed. Every building, every glowing window, every hurried figure moving through the streets felt like part of a grand design, his design. Inside the empire, the rhythm never faltered. Employees moved in a near-hypnotic pace, laptops glowing, phones ringing, conversations overlapping in a chaotic harmony that only he seemed to conduct perfectly. Meetings stretched endlessly, filled with soaring ideas and impossible deadlines. Mistakes were smoothed over by energy, by belief, by sheer force of momentum. The company thrived on speed, on devotion, on the illusion that everything was under control. But beneath the polished floors and gleaming glass, the foundation trembled. Budgets had grown unwieldy. Projects stretched beyond reason. Systems strained under weight they were never designed to bear. Whispers of concern moved through hallways, small tremors that employees tried to hide, fearing they might draw his attention, or his wrath. The empire shimmered brilliantly, but the cracks were growing, persistent and unyielding. He called a meeting in the largest auditorium the company had ever built. Glass walls reflected the city endlessly, creating the impression that the empire stretched infinitely, reaching beyond the horizon. Employees, investors, and select partners gathered, notebooks open, eyes wide, hearts beating in anticipation. He moved among them, barefoot, radiant, his energy almost painful in its intensity. He spoke of scale, of domination, of a vision so vast that it seemed to transcend reality. Towers, buildings, spaces, entire neighborhoods, he painted them in words, each more dazzling than the last. Momentum was everything. Growth was sacred. Doubt was weakness. Belief, he insisted, was the only currency that mattered. Yet even as he spoke, the whispers persisted. Small errors were noted in hidden corners. Budgets failed to reconcile. Employees noticed inconsistencies in reports and contracts, discrepancies that could not be easily explained. Some tried to speak up, only to be silenced by the sheer force of his presence, the radiant certainty that bent perception and bent reality alike. Late that evening, he wandered through an empty floor under renovation, a space that would soon become a hub of energy and productivity. The polished floors gleamed under artificial light, walls reflected the potential of what could be, and screens stood ready for the teams that would soon fill the rooms. He traced his hands along the walls, imagining the pulse of life that would soon inhabit the space, the devotion, the momentum, and yet, a subtle vibration ran through the floor beneath him, almost imperceptible, but enough to stir unease. He ignored it. Control, he believed, was not about acknowledging every tremor, it was about convincing everyone else that nothing could falter, that nothing could break, that the empire was invincible. Employees felt the strain more acutely each day. Exhaustion ran through the hallways like a silent disease. Mistakes multiplied, small at first, then larger, hidden beneath layers of activity. Budgets teetered. Projects faltered. The pace that had once inspired awe now threatened to consume those who sustained it. And yet, no one dared slow down. To falter was to risk being left behind, and belief demanded total devotion. On the rooftop, the founder looked out at the city, wind tearing through his hair, lights stretching endlessly below. He imagined the empire expanding beyond sight, reaching beyond borders, beyond comprehension. Momentum surged through him, intoxicating and unstoppable. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that energy, charisma, and vision could bend reality itself. But somewhere deep inside the empire, systems strained. Budgets diverged. Mistakes multiplied. Employees whispered. And beyond the polished floors and gleaming towers, the storm was gathering, silent, patient, inevitable. The first signs were faint, almost invisible, but persistent, like shadows stretching across sunlight. He turned from the window, smiling, radiant, untouchable, convinced that control was absolute. And yet, somewhere, in the corners of his empire, the first threads of chaos were weaving themselves together. A storm was coming, and when it struck, it would test every ounce of belief, every spark of energy, and every carefully maintained illusion. Tonight, the city pulsed quietly beneath the towers, unaware. And somewhere, in the foundations of the empire, the storm waited, patient, relentless, inevitable. Chapter 11, The First Cracks. The towers gleamed under the dawn, their glass surfaces catching the sunlight and scattering it into fragments of brilliance. From the top floor of the tallest building, he watched the city awaken, a network of movement, ambition, and energy. To him, it seemed alive, obedient, and malleable. Every street, every office, every hurried figure was part of a design he alone understood. Every pulse of the city beneath him was proof of his vision, proof of his momentum, proof that he controlled it all. Inside, the empire moved like a living organism. Employees scurried from meeting to meeting, fingers flying across keyboards, phones ringing incessantly. Mistakes were patched over, problems hidden beneath layers of energy and devotion. Meetings stretched endlessly, blending presentations, pitches, and performances of certainty. He moved among it all, barefoot and radiant, a conductor of devotion, shaping the rhythm of belief and motion. Expansion had reached its peak. Towers multiplied, offices filled beyond capacity, and projects stretched across the city like veins. Investors poured money in with almost religious devotion, captivated by the spectacle and dazzled by the scale. Contracts and spreadsheets became formalities, belief alone was enough. And he, untouchable and radiant, thrived in the energy of it all. Yet cracks had begun to form. Budgets no longer aligned. Systems strained under impossible demands. Employees whispered in corners about exhaustion, misaligned tasks, and missing funds. Mistakes multiplied, small at first, but persistent, impossible to ignore. And though he radiated certainty, the world beneath the shine was shifting, subtle tremors running through the foundation of the empire. One afternoon, a minor failure became impossible to hide. A key project, delayed and mismanaged, collapsed in front of investors and employees. Screens flickered with errors. Presentations dissolved into chaos. Promises made weeks ago were impossible to fulfill. The energy of the room wavered, and for the first time, the founder felt something he rarely experienced, uncertainty brushing against the edges of his control. He moved quickly, barefoot across the polished floors, voice rising with the intensity of a storm. He spoke of vision, of scale, of triumph. He reminded them of what they had built, of the momentum that no failure could break. And yet, even as he commanded attention, whispers persisted. Employees glanced at one another, noting discrepancies, missing documents, and strained systems. Doubt had arrived, subtle and quiet, but undeniable. Late that night, he wandered the empty halls of a newly renovated floor. The lights reflected endlessly on polished glass, multiplying his image in infinite repetition. He pressed his hand to the walls, imagining the energy that would fill the space, the devotion, the motion, the belief. But the tremor beneath his feet grew stronger, almost imperceptible yet insistent. It was the first tangible sign that perfection was impossible to maintain, that momentum could not bend reality indefinitely. Employees were beginning to fracture as well. Exhaustion gnawed at their focus. Some tried to hide it behind smiles and diligence, while others began documenting errors and missteps in secret, unsure who to trust. Investors noticed faint inconsistencies in reports, but the founder's charisma and momentum were a powerful shield, keeping most questions at bay. The empire shimmered, but the first cracks were now visible to those willing, or forced, to look. He remained radiant, moving through floors as if nothing had shifted. Meetings continued, presentations dazzled, and promises soared higher than ever. But beneath the polished surfaces, a subtle tension had taken root. Mistakes were growing bolder, budgets diverging further, and small systems failures multiplied, hidden by energy, momentum, and charisma. On the rooftop, the city stretched below him like a living map of ambition. Lights glimmered, streets twisted, movement flowed. He imagined the empire expanding beyond the horizon, beyond borders, beyond comprehension. Momentum surged, intoxicating, unstoppable, blinding him to the quiet tremors that threaded through his creation. But the cracks had begun to speak. They whispered in hidden corners. They flickered on screens. They trembled beneath floors. The first real fracture of the empire had appeared, subtle but undeniable. And though he smiled, radiant and untouchable, the storm that had been gathering finally began to make its presence known. The empire glimmered, shining and magnificent, but the first fissures had emerged. And when the storm hit in full, no amount of energy, charisma, or belief could prevent the collapse that was quietly, inexorably approaching. Chapter 12, The Fall of the Golden Tower. The city below was a glittering maze of lights and movement, unaware of the tension that had grown within the tallest towers. From the top floor, he gazed out, barefoot, radiant, as if nothing could touch him. Every street, every office, every figure moving in the streets was part of the rhythm he had created, a symphony of ambition that he conducted with unrelenting energy. The empire shimmered like gold, but beneath the brilliance, the first fissures had begun to widen. Inside, chaos lurked beneath the surface. Employees moved frantically, trying to patch mistakes, cover delays, and smooth over errors that multiplied like shadows in the night. Systems failed quietly, budgets fractured, and projects collapsed under their own weight. Whispers of concern had grown louder, though no one dared confront him directly. The illusion of perfection, once so intoxicating, now teetered on the edge of collapse. He walked through the halls of the empire as if untouched by reality, barefoot, radiant, exuding energy that drew people toward him even as it demanded everything from them. Meetings went on endlessly, presentations dazzled, and promises soared. Investors were still captivated, blinded by the scale and vision of the empire. But behind the shimmer, cracks had become impossible to ignore. It began with a single collapse. A building project, carefully planned but underfunded, fell apart publicly. Contractors withdrew, employees scrambled, and the polished image of perfection fractured in full view. Screens flickered with errors. Reports contradicted one another. Emails that had promised stability now revealed chaos. Momentum, once unstoppable, had met reality. He reacted with force, pacing the halls, raising his voice, weaving visions of triumph to cover the unfolding disaster. "We are unstoppable," he said, radiant, determined to bend perception to his will. Employees nodded nervously, scrambling to repair the damage, while investors held their breath, caught between awe and alarm. But the cracks were no longer subtle. They multiplied, spreading through budgets, systems, and promises like fire through dry wood. Employees, exhausted and fearful, whispered quietly in hidden corners. Some documented errors in secret, hoping for the day when truth could be addressed. Others tried to cling to momentum, believing it could carry them past collapse. But the energy that had sustained them, that had made them believe in the brilliance of his vision, now teetered on the edge of panic. Late that night, he stood alone on the rooftop of the tallest tower, gazing at the city beneath him. Lights shimmered, streets pulsed, and the empire seemed eternal. He pressed his hand to the glass, imagining new towers, new projects, new expansions, even as tremors beneath his feet reminded him that control was never absolute. His mind raced, thinking of fixes, of strategies, of ways to restore the illusion. But the fractures had grown too wide, the systems too strained, the cost too high. Then, it began. One system after another failed. Budgets collapsed. Employees faltered. Investors questioned, panic spreading quietly behind smiles. Momentum could no longer hold the pieces together. The golden glow that had seemed eternal began to dim. Mistakes, ignored and hidden for so long, erupted into visibility. The empire shimmered, but the shimmer was hollow. He moved through the chaos with the same energy he had always carried, barefoot and radiant, trying to restore order, trying to inspire belief, trying to convince reality itself to bend. But it would not. The foundations had cracked. The systems had failed. The devotion of employees and investors, though powerful, could not compensate for the fragile architecture of ambition. The final collapse was not loud, it was inevitable. Floors emptied, projects halted, budgets froze, contracts dissolved. The empire that had shimmered like gold, that had seemed unstoppable, fell quietly, piece by piece, under the weight of unacknowledged mistakes, exhausted employees, and overextended ambition. He stood in the center of it all, radiant, barefoot, surveying the empire that had once seemed untouchable. And for the first time, he felt the reality that belief alone could not alter. Towers gleamed, but they were empty. Lights shone, but they were hollow. Momentum had carried him far, but it had reached its limit. Outside, the city continued to pulse, oblivious to the collapse. And inside, the golden towers, once symbols of unyielding ambition, now stood as monuments to the cost of unchecked vision, to the fragility hidden beneath brilliance, to the inevitable truth that no empire, however radiant, can escape the weight of reality forever. The founder, radiant and untouchable in appearance, finally understood, if only for a fleeting moment, that belief could inspire, momentum could dazzle, and energy could bend perception, but nothing could hold back the gathering storm of consequences. Once the foundations had begun to crumble, and somewhere, deep beneath the shattered glow of the golden towers, the quiet whisper of inevitability echoed, all that rises must eventually face the fall. If you enjoyed this retelling, tell us in the comments, what's the next audiobook you want us to transform into a story you can truly imagine? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter on Momentum Mind.